Every day, a young fisherman named Syracuse heads out to fish off the coast of Ireland. One day, he finds a young woman tangled in his nets. He helps her, and when she regains consciousness, he's relieved to see that she's unharmed. However, she behaves oddly and refuses to go to the hospital. She also can't remember her name, which Syracuse assumes is due to amnesia. He takes her to his late mother's house, offers her sandwiches, and suggests she stay there for a while since he needs to see his daughter, Annie, who lives with his ex-wife, Maura. Today, he has to take Annie to her dialysis appointment. While the procedure is underway, he tells Annie a story about a fisherman who catches a woman from the sea. Annie explains that this woman might be a selkie, a creature she learned about at school that sometimes comes ashore until the sea calls them back. After the procedure, Syracuse takes Annie back to her mother, who excitedly shows her the new electric wheelchair she received. Annie demonstrates the chair for her father, but her mother quickly criticizes him for not discussing a new kidney with the doctor. The next morning, Syracuse finds the woman washing clothes in a stream, singing in an unfamiliar language. She asks if she can accompany him on his boat, and he agrees. On the way, she reveals her name is Ondine, which means from the water. Soon, Syracuse stops for lobster fishing, but the baskets come up empty. Ondine starts singing a song Syracuse has never heard, and suddenly the baskets are filled with lobsters. She helps him pull them out, surprised when he throws the smaller ones back into the sea. However, she refuses to go to the market with him. Syracuse sells the lobsters to astonished buyers and buys her a dress before picking up Annie from school. On the way home, he continues the story about the fisherman and the sea woman who sings to the fish, leading him to a bountiful catch. Annie thinks this tale resembles a dream since everything seems to be coming true, including the mysterious language Ondine sings in. After dropping Annie off at home, Syracuse returns, unaware that Annie is following him. When he arrives at the house, he gives Ondine clothes and food and finds her talking to his father, who asks how long she'll stay. Syracuse decides she'll stay forever, living with him happily ever after, just like in the fairy tale he's been telling Annie. After witnessing all of this, Annie goes to the library to research selkies. Meanwhile, Syracuse goes to church to confess, admitting he's an alcoholic despite not drinking for over 2 years. Lately, he's been troubled by a recurring dream where he attends the funeral of his ex-wife's new husband, Alex, after which he reunites with Maura, who still struggles with alcohol addiction. The priest advises Syracuse to see a psychologist, but Syracuse reminds him of the confidentiality of confession and reveals that he pulled a woman out of the water with his net and is now hiding her from everyone. The priest suggests he attend mass as there's little else he can do to help him. Meanwhile, Annie continues studying selkie legends, while Ondine cleans the cottage and examines the new items Syracuse brought her. She's especially fascinated by the fishnet stockings, which she stretches over her hand, making it look webbed. The next day, Annie visits her grandmother's cottage and sees Ondine swimming. She confidently approaches the shore and tells Ondine that she knew all along the story about the fisherman and the selkie wasn't just a fairy tale. Annie talks about her illness and asks Ondine to heal her, but Ondine explains that she doesn't possess any magic. Annie, curious and straightforward, asks many questions, and Ondine enjoys the lively conversation. Annie insists on honesty in their friendship, wondering what it's like underwater and whether it's better or worse than the surface. Ondine replies that it varies, but swimming is easier underwater. Annie shares what she's learned about selkies from her books, explaining that they can stay on land for up to 7 years if they find happiness with a human. Suddenly, she changes the topic to her grandmother, noting that her father still misses her a lot. Syracuse also goes to the library to borrow books about selkies, but discovers that Annie has already checked them out. Meanwhile, Annie meets up with neighborhood kids who show off their bikes. She lets one of the girls play with her wheelchair, but it runs out of power and rolls into the water. The kids leave her behind, and Annie has to make her way home on her own, where she's met by Alex. He recharges her wheelchair's battery and mentions that selkies are a legend from his homeland of Scotland, but Annie insists that Ondine speaks a different language. Meanwhile, Syracuse finds Ondine on a pontoon in the middle of the bay and offers to take her back to his boat. He asks her to hold the tiller, but when a patrol boat speeds by, Ondine hides and steers the boat with her foot. Syracuse teases her, noting that she handles the boat well with her feet. As she begins singing again, Syracuse pulls up his net to find it filled with a large catch of salmon, a rare and lucky event for him. Syracuse notices the patrol boat returning, and the wildlife officers find the salmon on his boat, demanding to see the nets he used. He shows them the usual nets for catching salmon, which are completely dry, proving he's telling the truth. However, the officers spot Ondine in the hold. She confirms that Syracuse caught the salmon using an ordinary net, and the officers leave, satisfied with their story. Relieved that they weren't caught and that nothing happened when Ondine was seen, they head to the harbor to sell the catch. Syracuse offers to buy her a gift, and she asks for another dress, which she wants to pick out herself. On their way to the store, they run into Annie, who's excited to see that their story isn't just a fairy tale. Annie helps Ondine pick out an outfit while the townspeople stare at the beautiful stranger through the shop window. Later, Annie arrives at her grandmother's house, which looks festive and cozy thanks to Ondine's efforts. Ondine offers to teach Annie how to swim, and she agrees, feeling reassured by having someone from the sea with her. They play in the shallow water when Ondine suddenly spots something in the water and asks Annie to get on the raft. She pulls out a bundle which Annie identifies as Selkie clothing. According to legend, if Ondine buries it in the ground, she can stay on land for 7 years, provided her sea husband doesn't come for her. Ondine listens to Annie and buries the bundle in a greenhouse while Annie counts the steps to remember the exact spot. Later, Annie tells her father about it and warns him to be cautious of strangers. They all head to the local festival by boat, where Ondine denies Annie's belief that she can grant wishes because she's not really a Selkie. Upset, Annie pretends that her wheelchair brakes have failed and falls off the pier, hoping to test the truth of Ondine's words. Ondine immediately jumps in to save her, pulling the girl to the surface. Syracuse carries Annie home and hands her over to Mora and Alex. Later, Ondine tells Syracuse that the wheelchair's brakes worked fine and that Annie was testing whether she could breathe underwater. Syracuse confesses that he used to drink heavily but decided to stay sober after finding Annie's mother passed out next to their unconscious child one day. They saved Annie, and he realized one of them had to remain sober at all times. Meanwhile, Mora tells Annie that a dark-haired stranger has been asking about the fisherman's girlfriend, which causes Annie to have a nightmare. As Syracuse and Ondine become intimate, he later goes to confession and admits to the priest that he slept with Ondine the previous night. Now he fears the luck she brings because he's lost hope for anything good. He knows that something either wonderful or terrible is going to happen, and he's afraid of both. After leaving the church, Syracuse is approached by an unknown man who starts asking questions about Ondine, but Syracuse ignores him and walks away. That day, Syracuse takes Annie to her dialysis appointment as usual, but when they return home, no one is there. Mora and Alex have been out drinking at a nearby pub. Syracuse takes Annie there, and when they finally reach home, he finds the door broken in and Ondine missing. Syracuse searches along the shore and eventually finds her hiding. Ondine reminds him of the Selkie's husband and says that he's here to take her away. Meanwhile, the intoxicated Mora is riding her daughter's wheelchair, and despite Alex's warnings, she insists on making it home. Syracuse hides Ondine in a secret cave behind a waterfall, offering to grant her a wish, but her only wish is for Annie to get well. So Syracuse wishes for her to be able to stay. Meanwhile, the man searching for Ondine is driving around town and gets into a car accident, colliding with a car driven by the intoxicated Mora. Alex is thrown through the windshield, while Annie, who managed to buckle up, still sustains injuries. The climax of the story unfolds as Syracuse and Ondine drive by and recognize the car crash involving Mora, Alex, and Annie. Syracuse panics and rushes to the medics, who are loading Annie onto a stretcher to take her to the hospital. Later, Syracuse and Ondine find Annie in the hospital, where they learn she's undergoing an immediate kidney transplant, miraculously matched with Alex, who had passed away in the accident. While waiting, Ondine encounters the unknown man from earlier in the hospital hallway. He confronts her, questioning why she speaks their language, reminding her that neither of them belongs here. They're from the sea, not this world. Ondine asks him to return home without her. The next morning, Annie wakes up and immediately asks about Ondine. Syracuse reassures her that they'll see Ondine soon. Sometime later, Alex's cremation ceremony takes place. Mora scatters his ashes over the sea, reflecting on her regrets and asking Syracuse to take care of Annie, but she insists that he must get rid of Ondine. She forces him to drink to Alex's memory, and in his drunken state, Syracuse goes to the boat where Ondine is hiding. He angrily calls her a Selkie and takes her out to sea, demanding that she return to her husband and sing her songs to him. He brings her to the lighthouse, insisting she must leave. As dusk falls, he sails away, believing that life isn't a fairy tale and that people and Selkies can't be together. Ondine sits on a log, her silhouette giving the appearance of a woman with a tail. As night falls, she jumps into the sea. The next morning, the priest wakes Syracuse, who is filled with regret. He realizes his mistake and brings Annie from the hospital to his home. Annie comforts him, saying that Ondine will return because she left something behind. Later, while watching TV, Syracuse hears an Icelandic band, Sigur Rós, performing and suddenly recognizes the language Ondine spoke. He realizes that Ondine was an ordinary woman and rushes to the lighthouse. At first, he can't find her, but soon he sees a fire where Ondine is warming herself. Ondine initially claims she's a sea creature who buried her magical clothes to stay with the family she loves, but Syracuse demands the truth. Ondine finally admits that her real name is Ioana and that she was a courier delivering illegal substances from Romania. She explains that while escaping from the police, her guard threw her into the water, leaving her to drown. Syracuse's net saved her. They return home, but criminals are already there, having taken Annie hostage. Syracuse tries to fight them off, but struggles against the two armed men. The criminals force them to the greenhouse, believing Ondine's story about the Selkie's clothing buried there. However, they find nothing, as Annie had hidden the package elsewhere. Ondine promises to stay with Annie and reveals the package is hidden in a lobster crate. The group heads to the boat where the criminals lift the basket, but Annie reminds Ondine that she's a Selkie, not them. Ondine seizes the moment, throwing one of the villains overboard where he drowns. Syracuse disarms the other and throws him into the water. The arriving police arrest the criminal along with Ondine, who faces deportation unless she gains citizenship or gets married. In the final scenes, Annie goes to confession and mentions that her father is getting married soon, reflecting on how, even though Ondine wasn't a real Selkie, you can't marry a seal, can you? The movie ends with a touching scene of a girl in a white dress and a fisherman in a suit sailing off on their boat for a honeymoon, bringing the fairy tale of happiness between a human and a Selkie to life.